This segment of the show, we look back at stories that made headlines in the past week. We start with the second presidential gender-based violence summit, and we're going to look at progress that's been made thus far. So that discussion we're going to bring right towards the end, because we're going to bring in my colleague Zikhona Tshona. But we're also going to look at the discovery of the 21 bodies suspected to be those of illegal miners in Krugersdorp. And then we'll conclude the conversation with, among other topics, the terror alerts that were issued by the United States. What impact has this had on the two countries' relations? And to explore this with us is Teboho Khaas, and he is a political commentator joining me in studio at the moment. So let's get straight into it. Let's begin with the discovery of over 20 bodies. And these are people that are suspected at the moment. We have to be quite careful around the use of the word, them being referred to as illegal miners. At the moment, the assumption is that they are assumed to be illegal miners because they have been found in this area. Is South Africa winning this war against illegal mining in the country?
In fact, Cody, that just tells us succinctly that actually government is not winning that war. Remember a few weeks ago, when there was all this media blitz that Minister Bekicele and divisional commissioners of police did, and saying, look, we are getting on top of this. We are actually even deploying the Maberete or some other specialized units to go and do and address the issue of illegal mining. We still have it. We still have this. It's a sad indictment, because what it tells us is that we've just been lied to. They are nowhere near addressing these issues. In fact, it points to something that many people also suspect. It's no longer suspicion, because it is true. Yeah. The corruption within the police. Because it could only be that people are able to go back and continue with this as if life is as normal, because the police are turning a blind eye, or are just being made not do their jobs.
It's interesting that you say it doesn't look like we are winning this war against illegal mining in the country, because when I spoke to the police yesterday, in a similar vein, the answer was almost to the affirmative of what you are saying, because the police spokesperson says, we have been to Krugersdorp, and that's the area that we have focused our attention on at the time of the rape, the tragic rape of these women, allegedly by these so-called illegal miners. But we cannot stay in the area any longer once our police operations have gotten in there and we feel that we have done the job. And so, can we really place the blame squarely or only on the police? Because there are several other departments that come along: mineral resources, home affairs.
But this is a policing issue. Currently, it is a policing issue. Mineral resources, yes, they do have a role to play, but to the extent that people still find their way into doing illegal activities, conducting illegal activities, it means police are not doing their work. It means they're not doing their job, and yes, they must accept responsibility, because they treated it as an event. They ought to have said, this is a short-term approach to this problem, this is a medium-term, and what is the long-term? But to say, look, we've stabilized the things, all the cameras are gone, now we can go. I don't think that cuts it, because it means that they didn't find a lasting solution to these problems.
I think the police minister, Bekicele, would probably have a thoroughgoing conversation between you and I, trying to defend his office, to say that you can't say that we treat these as an event as opposed to ongoing operations. He'll probably point to Stilfontein, that's in the northwest. That's where they arrested yet more people, and at some point there were also the so-called, I think the top of the chain, top of the food chain. I think these were part of the words that he used, because these were now people that possibly could take us a little closer to those that are actually financing this illegal activity. But we've got to bring in the other dimension here, Mr. Khaas, and that is the communities where this illegal mining is taking place, or at least communities that live nearby. Because in Stilfontein, or that Stilfontein case, very interesting comments coming outside of court from those who say, we are the family members of these people. We are wives, we're girlfriends, and these are breadwinners to us, and that's why they must be released. Talk to us about the socio-economic realities.
No, you're quite right. There's quite a disjuncture of sorts, because on the one hand, communities expect police to do their job, their work, and make sure that they protect us, they protect the resources, whether they are abandoned mines or still active mines. And to the extent that they seem to be failing, and the communities seem to also be keeping a blind eye, or even encouraging it to some extent. It is sad, because even in Krugersdorp, some of the people who were found as illegal miners were actually renting backyard rooms in Kagiso. And the people, their landlords, know what type of business these people do, and they're quite happy to turn a blind eye because they are benefiting financially from such activity. So it is a problem that requires a multi-pronged approach between society and government, and here I'm talking about policing and even the Department of Mineral Resources. But it means that there's a disconnect between government and communities, because what happens to the people's representatives of those areas, the parliamentarians, the councillors, are they not engaging communities to say, let us make sure that we address these issues? When you see something, say something. Yeah. And that is where the problem is.
I want to move on to the next topic, but perhaps the caveat on this topic of illegal mining is that perhaps up until we find the people that are financing this illegal trade, maybe then that's when we can actually finally put a stop to it. But let's talk about the terror alerts that have been issued by the United States. This is something that was done just towards the end of the week last week, and I remember I was in KZN for the King's coronation. There was a big match taking place here in Gauteng, the derby, the famous derby between Orlando Pirates and Kaizer Chiefs, and then there was the Pride March in Sandton. None of these events were actually targeted, or should we say, none of what the U.S. predicted came to be. What should we make of this whole event?
Yeah, for the first time in my life, I really wanted to attend that Pride March, and I think I'll do so next year, given a chance, because just in spite of what the U.S. actually did, because I think it was very unbecoming of the U.S. to actually issue such statements, especially in light of the fact that government alleges that they were not informed prior to ensure that they are prepared for such a statement being issued by the State Department. And to the extent that it actually sought to create angst or uneasy within the communities, it was unwelcome. And you don't expect that from people that you regard as friends. It played into the realms of conspiracy theories. Yeah. People were linking it to the arrival of a boat, of a yacht, a Russian oligarch, whom the U.S. wanted South Africa to impound, and South Africa said no. Yeah. And also the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa and Africa has now been put under the spotlight.
So I'm happy that you brought on the element about the ship, the yacht that comes from Russia, possibly belonging to some Russian oligarch. Does that suggest that we may be in the throes of geopolitics that we may not be aware of, but because of the role we play at the level of the United Nations, perhaps we're now being brought in, or we've inadvertently gotten ourselves into something that's far bigger than us?
The problem is we don't take a side. We don't make it firm in terms of our foreign policy where we stand. We stand with anybody and anything that we think might work or will work for us. We don't take a stand. You recall during the times of Nelson Mandela, when he reprimanded President Clinton and said, you cannot choose for us who our friends must be. if we are to visit or invite Fidel Castro, we shall do that. And that is where everybody knew where South Africa stood. Even how we voted at the UN, people knew that we would vote and align ourselves with human rights causes. Yeah. But currently, we vote depending on what China and Russia's whims seem to be at the time. So it is worrisome, and it just exposes some sort of lack of certainty in terms of foreign policy, and I think it's also worrisome because we tend to, if you look at our the president's visit to the White House, he extracted some good wins, but also immediately after that we saw him also almost like being apologizing or feeling apologetic about the whole visit and actually fraternizing with Russia again. So it's actually confusing, and the U.S. ought to also appreciate the fact that how would it, the question, I think somebody asked a question, a pertinent question as to what would the United States do if the South African mission in the U.S. were to issue such an alert. Every day, almost every week, there are mass shootings in the U.S. There's
not once do I remember South Africa issuing a statement to say, please take precaution, you South African citizens who may be there.
And never mind South Africa, does the U.S. even issue its own statement saying there's a potential shooting at this school or at that mall? They don't. But then they use that to actually be scarecrow, to actually make South Africa feel disorganized and to even create discord within the communities.
It basically creates panic.
Yep.
All right, I want us to move to yet another important topic that took place this week. And with us in the table now, on the round table, is Zikhona Tshona. But let's start with this. And it was one of the key conversations that took place this week. Zikhona Tshona covering the second presidential gender-based violence summit that ended yesterday with calls for more to be done to end this scourge of violence and femicide against women, including children. Let's just take a listen to this first.
A 34-year-old lesbian was raped in Kimberley, gang raped by 3 men. Satellite bite with paraffin. No psychosocial support, no counseling from your department, no visits from your department.
Zikhona Tshona, you're here with us. You attended that summit. Talk to us first about the major sentiment coming out of that. I think the president, now that COVID seems to be taking a slide, GBV and femicide is now the country's #1 pandemic. Am I right?
Certainly, that was uttered there at that gathering by the president. He says it's out of control, and he did concede that as a country, as government, that they are not giving it the attention and the agency and urgency that it actually deserves. Key thing that came out of there is that civil society needs to be funded in order for it to be able to do the work on the ground to fight gender-based violence. NGOs are saying that they feel as though they are the only ones implementing the National Strategic Plan to fight gender-based violence and femicide. They're saying government is not coming to the party, as well as the private sector not coming to the party. So they really feel as though government needs to do more, particularly when it comes to funding NGOs. Of course, we had the president admitting that government is failing civil society. Let's take a listen at what the president had to say. But also, I think another key thing that came out of there is the fact that the president says the work, particularly when it comes to young boys and young men, needs to start at school level as well as university level to teach young men, young boys, how to be accountable for their actions, but also how to be respectful towards women. Not just government alone fighting the scourge of gender-based violence, but communities participating in grooming and nurturing men to be responsible figures in society. Let's take a listen to what the president had to say.
All right.
We have not mobilized the resources that are required for effective behavior change programs that link up the efforts of social partners in communities to address the attitudes and actions of men. In every part of society, in every workplace, in every school and college and university, in every government department, and in every municipality, we need to be organizing men's dialogues.
Mr. Khaas, let's bring you in to this GBVF scourge in the country. Another talk shop. It is the GBV Summit number 2. Anything tangible for you that's been done thus far?
Well, you know, there's a saying in Setswana and Sesotho that says, so far we're not seeing any stripes at all. We had our zebras out there intended to deal with the scourge of GBVF. But from what I see or from what I observe out there is that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And it is something that we believe government ought to go back to the drawing board and look into his strategy in terms of how he intends to deal with that. In fact, just like Zikhona mentioned, you need to ensure that this doesn't. It's a multi attack on the problem. In other words, deal with it from all layers. Yeah. Look at from, school level, early learning, primary, high school, and so forth, and look into making sure that you bring communities. There's a buy-in, because otherwise it ends up being, I hate to use the word talk shop, but being talks about eliminating gender-based violence. But we know that it still happens. But most importantly, we as men ought to actually take up this conversation ourselves, because we also know who misbehaves. We also know who mistreats their girlfriend, their wife, or other people, and we keep a blind eye. Yeah. We keep a blind. We actually even share on internet or even on WhatsApp groups clips of people who are denigrating women, either body shaming women or girls and so forth. Yeah. And because it offers us some entertainment, we need to be able to look ourselves in the eyes and say, is it the right thing to be doing? And how do we able to make sure that we actually talk to each other and make sure that we show each other that this is not the right way to do it? Because that's where it starts. It starts with innocuous comments, innocuous sharing of this type of information, to now being actually thinking we can actually execute it physically.
Yeah. Zikhona, Tshona, let's wrap it up. Civil society organizations, quite strong.
Civil society organizations are also asking government as to why it's dragging its feet on gazetting the National Council on Gender-Based Violence Bill, because that will hold government constitutionally liable and accountable to the fight of gender-based violence. So they're saying it's not enough that they have these summits, and they, in fact, one of the leaders of this organization that led to this summit being launched and sitting, actually hoping that this will be the last summit of its kind, because they're saying the talk is just not enough. There needs to be implementation of the talk now. Work needs to be done on the ground. And if they have another summit, they'll keep on having more summits, and the fight won't be won. But Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence is one of the leaders of the summit, who initiated the president holding the summit, marched to the union buildings in 2018, and the summit actually sitting was one of their demands, to say they want the president to lead a summit of this kind, to bring government in on the conversations with civil society when it comes to them committing and affirming themselves to being taking a stand against the fight against gender-based violence. So let's take a listen to Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence, who are saying they hope this is the last one of its kind.
All right.
We held this summit because there's a backlog in terms of the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. What we want to see now is implementation. What we want to see is this plan to actually see the light of day, for it to be properly resourced, for it to be championed by people on the ground. So if we do what we're supposed to do coming from this summit, then we shouldn't have a meeting like this again.
And unfortunately, time always the enemy. It's quite an emotive issue, but I have to end this conversation here. My thanks to you, Zikhona Tshona, giving us the backstory to this summit, the second of its kind. Teboho Khaas, political commentator, thanks indeed for making the time.